Have you ever tried to explain what you're going through and watch the other person's eyes glaze over? Or have you heard yourself say, "I'm fine," not because you are fine, but because the real answer is too complicated, too long, and too likely to be met with something that makes you feel worse than if you'd said nothing at all? Maybe you've been told, "But you look so well. Everyone gets tired. Have you just tried pushing through it?" Maybe it's anxiety. And maybe you've learned over time to stop trying to explain, to keep the real experience of your days carefully contained within yourself, to present a version of yourself to the world that doesn't ask too much of anyone. If that is your life, if you are carrying an experience that the people around you cannot fully see, cannot fully understand, and sometimes actively dismiss, I want you to know something before we go any further. The loneliness of that experience is real. It is not self-pity. It is not catastrophizing. It is a genuine, profound, and largely unacknowledged form of isolation. One that has real consequences for the nervous system and for the body. And today we're going to give it the attention it deserves. Welcome back. I'm Madeleine Lowry, a neural retraining specialist. We're in the final stretch of our series on loneliness and the nervous system. In episode 123, we explored how chronic illness and loneliness feed each other, how illness creates isolation, and how that isolation worsens the very nervous system dysregulation that makes the illness harder to heal. Today, we're going deeper into one specific dimension of that experience, the one that, in my work with clients, comes up again and again as one of the most painful and most persistent sources of loneliness in the chronic illness experience. The loneliness of not being understood, of having an inner world, a daily reality of symptoms, limitations, grief, and complexity that the people around you cannot fully access, that the medical system frequently fails to validate, that friends and family, however loving, often cannot quite hold. It is the loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside, because the person may be surrounded by people who care about them, who check in, who ask how they're doing, who are in their own way genuinely trying, and yet the gap between what is being experienced and what can be communicated and received remains. And living in that gap is one of the loneliest experiences there is. Let me start by naming what we mean when we talk about invisible illness. Invisible illness refers to any condition whose symptoms are not readily apparent to outside observers. This includes conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, fibromyalgia, dysautonomia and POTS, autoimmune conditions, chronic pain disorders, Lyme disease and its co-infections, long COVID, inflammatory bowel conditions, migraines, multiple chemical sensitivities, anxiety and depression, and many others. What these conditions share is not a specific symptom profile, but the experience of carrying something significant and real that others cannot see. The person may look well, may move through the world, at least intermittently, in ways that appear normal, may have days or hours of relative function that make the depth of their struggle invisible to those around them. And that invisibility creates a specific and compounding problem. Because when illness is visible, when there is a cast, a wheelchair, a clear diagnostic label that others recognize and respond to, the social contract around that illness is relatively clear. People know how to respond. They offer help. They adjust expectations. They make room. But when illness is invisible, that social contract is absent. The person is expected to function at a level their body cannot reliably sustain. Their limitations are not accommodated because they are not apparent. And when they cannot meet expectations, the explanation they offer is met with uncertainty at best and skepticism or dismissal at worst. I want to stay here for a moment because for many people with invisible illness, the experience of not being believed is one of the most deeply wounding dimensions of the entire experience. Not just once, but repeatedly, across doctors, family members, employers, friends. The doctor who attributes symptoms to anxiety or depression without fully investigating the physical picture. The family member who suggests that if you just tried harder, pushed through more, thought more positively, things would improve. The friend who stops including you in plans because you canceled too often, and who never really asks why. The colleague who assumes you are exaggerating or using illness as an excuse. Each of these encounters carries a message, not always intended, but clearly received. Your experience is not real, or not as serious as you say, or somehow your own fault. And for the nervous system, that message lands as a form of relational threat. As we've established throughout this series, the nervous system responds to societal threat in much the same way it responds to physical danger. Being dismissed, disbelieved, or invalidated activates the stress response. Stress hormones are released. The body goes into a defensive posture. And when this happens, repeatedly, when the experience of not being believed is not a single event, but a pattern, it accumulates. It becomes a stored charge in the nervous system, a hypervigilance around being seen and validated, a bracing before medical appointments, a careful self-editing before conversations about health, a chronic low-level grief for the acknowledgement that never quite arrives. One of the most specific and least acknowledged burdens of invisible illness is the energy cost of constant explanation. When your experience is not self-evident to others, you face a recurring choice in every relationship and every context. Do I explain? And if so, how much? And to whom? Explaining takes energy that is often already in short supply. It requires translating a complex, fluctuating, often difficult to articulate experience into language that someone without that experience can grasp. It requires managing the other person's response, which may include discomfort, skepticism, unsolicited advice, or a kind of sympathy that somehow makes things worse. And it requires doing all of that while also managing the symptoms themselves. Over time, many people with invisible illness develop what I can only describe as explanation fatigue. They stop trying to convey the full picture. They give the abbreviated version. They say, I'm okay or I'm managing because the real answer requires too much and returns too little. And that abbreviated self, the version of themselves that fits comfortably into conversations, that doesn't burden others, that hides the full weight of what is being carried, is a lonely self. Present in the relationship, but not fully there. I want to talk about something that many people with chronic illness carry quietly and rarely speak about directly. The grief of relationships that couldn't hold the weight of the illness. Because chronic illness tests relationships in ways that are real and significant. It changes the dynamic. It shifts what is needed, what is possible, and what is expected. And not all relationships have the capacity to accommodate that shift. Some friendships fade. Not through any single moment of rupture, but through the slow accumulation of canceled plans, of conversations that always seem to circle back to health, of an imbalance that the friendship wasn't built to sustain. Some family relationships become strained under the weight of worry, misunderstanding, the difficulty of watching someone suffer without being able to fix it, or simply the demands that chronic illness places on those closest to the person. Some romantic partnerships don't survive. The illness changes both people, changes what the relationship can be, and sometimes changes it beyond what either person can navigate. These losses are real, and they are rarely acknowledged as losses because the person is still alive, because the illness is still manageable, at least sometimes, because from the outside it can be hard to see what has actually been lost. But the person living it knows. And the grief of those losses, the friendships that thinned, the relationships that broke, the version of their social world that existed before illness, is a real and significant grief that deserves to be named. I want to take a moment to talk specifically about the relationship between people with chronic illness and the medical system. For many people with invisible illness, the medical system has been a source not just of help, but of significant relational wounding. The years of unexplained symptoms before a diagnosis, the suggestion that it might be psychosomatic, the referral to psychiatry when the physical picture is incomplete, the appointment that is too short to convey the full complexity of the experience, the specialist who reviews the file but doesn't quite see the person. These experiences accumulate, and they create something in the nervous system that goes beyond simple frustration. They create a hypervigilance around medical encounters, a bracing for dismissal, a tendency to over-prepare, to arrive with documentation, with timelines, with carefully organized symptom lists, because the person has learned that if they don't advocate loudly and specifically for themselves, their experience will not be fully received. That hypervigilance is exhausting, and it is lonely in a very particular way. The loneliness of navigating a system that was designed to help you, but that you cannot fully trust to see you. Now let's bring this back to the nervous system, because this is where the experience of being chronically unseen and misunderstood has its most significant and least recognized impact. Every experience of dismissal, disbelief, or invalidation activates the stress response. Every exhausting explanation that lands inadequately adds to the nervous system's load. Every relationship loss adds grief. Every medical encounter that requires hypervigilant self-advocacy costs energy and maintains threat activation. And all of this relational and social stress is happening on top of the nervous system dysregulation that is already part of the chronic illness picture. As we described in episode 123, the nervous system does not separate physical stress from relational stress. It registers all of it as threat. It responds to all of it with activation, and it maintains that activation as long as the threats, physical and relational, continue. The experience of being chronically misunderstood is, for the nervous system, a form of ongoing relational threat. And ongoing relational threat keeps the stress response running, which keeps the immune system dysregulated, which keeps sleep disrupted, which keeps the inflammatory burden elevated, which keeps the illness harder to manage and harder to heal. This is why the relational dimension of chronic illness, including the loneliness of being misunderstood, is not a secondary concern. It is a primary nervous system issue, and it deserves to be treated as such. Before I move on to how neural retraining can help, I want to say something about the value of finding even just one or two people who genuinely understand. Not people who have read about your condition, not people who sympathize from a distance, but people who know from the inside what it is to live with an invisible illness, who don't need the explanation, who already understand the vocabulary of fluctuating symptoms, of canceled plans that aren't a choice, of the gap between how you look and how you feel. This might be a community, online or in person, of people with similar experiences. It might be a therapist or a practitioner who truly gets it. It might be one friend or family member who has taken the time to really understand. The nervous system impact of being genuinely understood, even in one relationship, even occasionally, is not small. Being seen, as the nervous system registers it, is the opposite of threat. It is safety, and safety, real, felt, relational safety, is one of the most powerful inputs into nervous system regulation there is. If you don't yet have that in your life, finding it in whatever form is accessible to you, is worth prioritizing. Not as a luxury, but as a genuine part of healing. Now let's talk about what neural retraining can offer. The work of neural retraining addresses the loneliness of being misunderstood at several levels simultaneously. The first is the accumulated charge of past experiences of dismissal and invalidation. The medical encounters that wounded, the conversations that left you feeling more alone than before, the relationships that couldn't hold what you were carrying. In neural retraining, the subconscious mind begins to process and neutralize the emotional charge stored around these experiences, not to erase them, but to dissolve the raw, unprocessed intensity that keeps the nervous system treating them as ongoing threats. And as that charge dissolves, something shifts in how the person approaches future encounters. The bracing before medical appointments begins to quiet. The hypervigilant self-advocacy relaxes, not because the person stops advocating for themselves, but because they are no longer doing it from a place of accumulated fear and grief. They can be clearer, calmer, and paradoxically more effective in communicating their experience. The next level is the identity dimension, because years of being dismissed and misunderstood can quietly erode a person's trust in their own experience. When your perception of what is happening in your body is repeatedly contradicted by others, it can be harder to trust what you know. Neural retraining works to restore that trust, to reconnect the person with the authority of their own experience, and to dissolve the subconscious charges around self-doubt that accumulated through years of not being believed. And the third level is the grief, for the relationships that didn't survive, for the social world that existed before illness, for the experience of moving through life without the burden of constant explanation. And as that grief is processed, people often find something they didn't expect. A genuine settling, a capacity to be present in their life as it actually is, rather than perpetually grieving the life they were supposed to live. And from that more settled place, connection, real, meaningful, nourishing connection, becomes more possible. Not because the illness is gone necessarily, but because the nervous system is no longer spending so much of its energy on the relational wounds that surrounded it. If you have spent years carrying an experience that the people around you cannot fully see, if you've learned to abbreviate yourself, to say that you're fine when you're not, to present a version of your life that doesn't ask too much of anyone, if you have grieved relationships that couldn't hold the weight of your illness, or sat in medical offices feeling more alone than when you walked in, I want you to know that what you are carrying is real. The loneliness of being misunderstood is not self-pity. It is not weakness. It is the entirely appropriate response of a nervous system that is wired for connection and recognition, and that has been chronically deprived of both. And that can change. Not necessarily by finding people who understand, though that does matter, and I hope you do find them, but by working with the nervous system itself, with the accumulated charge of years of dismissal and loss, so that the weight of that begins to lift. And when that happens, something often shifts in how the world feels. The same encounters that used to wound begin to land differently. The same relationships begin to have more room. And the self that learned to hide, the full, complicated, unabbreviated self, begins to find its way back. In our final episode, we're going to bring this entire series together and talk about what healing from loneliness actually looks like from the inside out. If you would like to learn more about this work in the meantime, please visit us at tcneuralretraining.com. Schedule a free consultation by phone or take our free quiz. And if this episode resonated with you, please follow the podcast, give it a positive rating, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. Content of this podcast, copyright 2026, by Twin Cities Neural Retraining. Music by Barbara Ben.